This is going to be kind of a hard video for me to make, but I think it's something that I have to make because I've been in recovery now for a number of years, quite a few years, and I can't say that through my life all bad has happened. But I have to say that the way I was raised, the fanaticism with which my parents embraced their religion and how it affected me and my brothers and my peers in the Bible students had an effect that is long-lasting. Now, not everybody reacts the same way. Not everybody heals the same way. There's no magic pill that one can take to make it all go away, to make it all right, to make everything perfect, and to wipe away the damage that was done, the scars that were left from the abuse that took place, and the feelings that were engendered within you as an abused child, especially an abused child from a religious point of view, because everything is justified. The abuse is justified. They're serving God, the highest power in the universe. And he's watching it every moment. And you better do what's right, because God's always watching. God knows everything. He knows the heart. He counts the hairs on your head. He knows everything about us. And you have no choice but to obey. And that leaves you vulnerable. And the religion and its doctrines, especially with how they relate to sin and the condition that is acclaimed to be imposed upon us by the sins of our fathers, that Isaiah 18, where it talks about the sins of the fathers. No more shall it be said, something about the sour grapes and the children's teeth being set on edge, and that no more will the sin pass down from father to son, but each would be responsible for their own sins. But that it's deeply impressed in us from the time we were born, that we were born into sin and iniquity, and that we are, in the eyes of God, the great judge of heaven, wicked and evil by nature, and that in order for us to gain life, we must do certain things. We must behave certain ways. And we must submit to a culture that has been defined by the religion that we were in. And when the religion is abusive and it tells you that you're nothing worth anything, that your worth is defined by your relationship with God, then it's a very dangerous thing. And it makes you feel that you're imperfect, that you are defective in some way, and that you are without God some bug that isn't worth living. And we were constantly reminded as children of the sin we were in. And there was a lot of, that's what all the discussion was. All the talks, all the testimonies were about the condition we were in, that we were afflicted by Satan's lie, and that as sinners we must comply to the laws of God, and these are what laws that must be lived by, and you must be separate from the world, and you must know the truth, and that we have the truth, that the rest of the world is in blindness and darkness and being ruled by Satan, and that we must hold fast to the doctrines of the truth in order to gain salvation. And if we don't, because of the fact that we were given the special privilege of the knowledge of the truth, if we ever leave that knowledge, if we ever defy that knowledge, if we ever leave the brethren and leave the religion, that we could be subject to second death. Second death was used in a way by Bible students very analogous to the doctrine of hell. While there is no eternal suffering, it's something about human nature to want to live regardless. As long as there's life, and life to us is our consciousness, being conscious, being self-aware, being awake, and knowing who we are, that we are who we are, and that the dead know nothing, that there is no, it's worse than sleep, because at least in sleep there's some level of awareness with dreams. And the doctrine of hell, as horrific as it may sound, there is a sense of oneself. There is a consciousness of one's being, albeit a torturous, eternal suffering. But human nature is that if there's life, if there is awareness, there's always hope. Hope springs eternal. So in a sense, the doctrines that were being taught by Bible students, that the wicked and the defiant and those that rebel against the truth go into second death, which is non-existence and non-awareness, was even more scary than the doctrine of hell, in which the idea of a hope, as long as there's consciousness, there's always hope in the human spirit. That's why we make these movies about people who overcome insurmountable odds, and we love these movies. We put people in situations that are impossible for them to escape, and yet they do. And it's that idea that hope springs eternal within the human soul that exists within us. It's an inherent an inherent trait. That's why death scares us, because we really don't know. We really can't. I mean, the Pope or the bishops or the reverends or the preachers, and they tell us what the Bible says, and they tell us that there's a hope, and that there's a life after death, an existence after death. People are terrified of death. People are terrified of the idea of non-existence. And so they create these things. The Bible teaches that there's some existence after death, and whether or not, how you live defines what that existence will be: eternal bliss in heaven or eternal bliss on earth, as the Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses teach, or eternal suffering. But there's this idea of an eternal existence that always is there. And so, in a sense, the concept of going into second death is a worse idea than dying and going to hell or purgatory or whatever doctrinal belief there is. And I grew up in this every day. It was, you see, there was no separation in our family. And I think this is true of a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses. But in the Bible students, there was no separation of family and the religion. The religion was like an amoeba that absorbed our family, that we were all encompassed and swallowed up by this amoebic entity, and that in every element, in every aspect of our lives, the religion permeated every single detail, every single thing, every single second of our lives. It dominated us. And because, especially in the Bible students, it was such a small religion. Everybody knew each other. Everybody was into everybody's business, that we had to live a certain way, or else it would get around that something happened. There was a huge rumor mill in the Bible students, and you had to live just so, or else it would get around that there was some kind of a problem. And so we had this network, and to me, and it wasn't just me, it was others that felt that we were a part of some big family. And that's the way it was presented, that we belonged, or we had this opportunity to be a part of the 144,000, part of God's intimate family, and that these were people of the truth. They lived their lives beyond reproach. That's, my father always said that I was a failure in being an example to my brothers as the oldest, that I had the responsibility of being an example to them, and that the trouble that they got into was because I set the example, that I was the problem, and that I should live my life like him, beyond reproach. And I took on the guilt. I took on the shame of not only my own behavior, but the behavior of my brothers. And my mother, who grew up an only child, pretty much from the time she was a young girl. My maternal grandparents reconnected with the Bible students when my mother was a young girl, and And my mother was baptized at the age of 14. She lived in a clueless life. She just followed. She was a wallflower, and and really was not somebody who had one foot, in reality. I mean, she could fake it, but she really was what people would call, colloquially or whatever, I guess, in slang, a space cadet. She never really had a full grasp of what was real and what wasn't real, and she would make up a world of her own that she lived in. Although she could function to some extent in this world, everybody understood her as a very strange and would accommodate her for being strange. I mean, her bosses would accommodate her. But she really didn't have any grasp on reality. She lived in this strange world. We'd take vacations, and her recollections of our vacation had no bearing at all on what we actually did, and that really bothered me. That really it reinforced this sense of defectiveness that I was being raised in, and that I was terrified that I might be like her. And people always, kids especially, can be cruel in school, and they always peg me out in school as being different. As first off, the kids always talk about religion. What religion are you? And being in the New York City metropolitan area, we had a diversity of religions. I mean, we had Catholic, we had Protestant, we had Jewish, probably in equal parts. And then we also had Asian individuals who had their own beliefs, Hinduism, and that it was during the 60s, the late 50s and early 60s, when things really began to change in our country, and that immigration, especially in the New York area, brought a diversity of cultures into close proximity to one another. And yet, I always felt different. I never felt a part of what was going on around me, mainly because we were never around. I wasn't really allowed to have friends. Kids would talk about, religion. In fact, they actually had time off from school to go to religion schools. There were the Jewish children got a specific day, afternoon off, to go to Hebrew school, and the Catholic children had time off from school on another day to be able to go to Catholic school to learn doctrines. And this is in the public school systems. They would give them time off so that these children could go and get their religious training. And when I was asked, what religion am I? If I said Bible student, then what's a Bible student? In my earliest years, I really didn't know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses. Not until the 1964 World's Fair did I understand that there were Jehovah's Witnesses, and that we always felt that we had the truth, and that Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the Bible Students in the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, was the founder of the Bible Students movement, and I didn't know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses and Rutherford or anything like that. But a few Bible students really talked about that, although many Bible students that I knew lived in that area. My own grandparents and great-grandparents even knew Russell. My maternal great-grandparents moved to Brooklyn from Scotland in 1909 just to be in proximity to the Bethel because they had been converted quickly by the purser of the ship that they came from Scotland on the steamer Columbia. And the purser was a Bible student and recommended that they move to Brooklyn so that they could be near the Bible students in the Bethel. And that's how my grandmother grew up. She was only 6 years old when they first moved from Scotland to the United States in 1909. And she remembers Russell, and she remembered even having an interview with Russell because my great-grandmother was very concerned about 1914 and the end times and whether or not my grandmother might make it or not. But we had these values. The Bible students lived by very, very specific and rigid values. And these values were defined in the 6th volume of Russell's Studies in the Scriptures series. He had written 6 volumes, and the 6th volume was the New Creation, and it explicitly detailed the life of a consecrated individual, and that was imposed upon us. It wasn't just our parents living these ideals, but that was imposed upon us, that lifestyle, those values, and the oppression was tremendous. A typical Sunday morning meeting at the McBurney YMCA, and you'd seen that video, the YMCA. We'd get up. We lived in Rockland County, about a 45-minute drive out from 23rd Street, where the Y was, and us boys were constantly being yelled at for holding up my parents from leaving on time. See, I was born 7 years after they were married, and they weren't. They had held off having children because of the idea that 1954 was going to be the kingdom. And when 1954 didn't prove right, I was born the next year in 1955. And then my brothers born boom, boom, boom. We were 2 years apart, my 2 younger brothers. Plus, my mother had a miscarriage, which she blamed on me for her struggling with me pushing a carriage up a steep hill, that she overstressed herself and had the miscarriage. So it would have been another brother. I would have had a 4th brother. But everything, all the guilt, all the shame, all the burden was laid on me. And as the oldest, I was to take care of my brothers. And I had grown up with this sense, of not being the same I'm getting a little off track because I was talking about the meetings on Sunday, and there was always a lot of chaos, a lot of screaming, particularly by my mother. My father would get angry, but he didn't rage like my mother. My mother was she'd slap us across the face. I remember one morning my brother with a broken arm was late because he couldn't get dressed very well. He had a cast on his forearm, and she screamed at him to get ready. And when he came down the stairs late, she hauled off and slapped him across the face as hard as she could several times. And that's how we would go off to meetings. Sometimes unfed, they would eat because they'd get up early, but they didn't have anything for us ready. And sometimes we'd go off to meetings unfed. In the breakfast, we'd arrive in New York we'd leave home by 8 and get to New York by 9 because my father had to socialize. He was an elder. And meetings began at 10, and then from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock was the last meeting. We would be in the YMCA having meetings, and we'd have to sit in these steel fold-out chairs quietly while the meetings were going on. And they did have a Sunday school for us kids, but outside of that, we were supposed to sit in the meetings. And then we wouldn't get home until about 6 o'clock every Sunday. So Sundays were gone. And consequently, I never did well in school. And the abuse was tremendous, and the fact that my father left us in the care of my mother, who was mentally ill. Things were not very good. My wife, after she and I were first married, she was interested in learning about me because we had gotten married so quickly. She went digging in old boxes of stuff that my mother had kept, and in one of these boxes were school work and school art and things that I made, letters that I had written to my grandparents because when my grandfather and grandmother moved to Florida in 1964, I wrote my grandfather almost every week because we were very close. I had a very, very close relationship with my grandfather, much closer than my own parents. And I really didn't care for my mom at all. She did sexually abuse us boys. I know I was sexually abused, and these are things that I had eventually taken up in counseling. But she and my father obviously didn't have a very close, intimate relationship, and she was very frustrated. And so she couldn't fight, I guess, the compelling urge to abuse and sexually. And I think about that, and that is the hardest thing of all to cope with, because it really means that it just makes you feel worthless. It makes you feel like the only thing that you're good for is that person's gratification. And and it's a very difficult thing to talk about. I found it was years before I could discuss it. I felt so ashamed and so embarrassed, and I knew my counselor well, but that was something that was hidden, something I kept from him. But my wife had gone through a bunch of boxes, and she got a hold of a bunch of my early report cards from when I was in first, second, third, fourth grades, and all of them had teacher's notes that said that I didn't pay attention in class, that I was always gazing out the window in a daydream. And today, the psychologists, they call that dissociation from reality, because it was the only way I knew how to protect myself. One teacher picked up on it in particular, and she actually abused me even further, noting that something was very wrong, and that occurred in the fourth grade. And actually, I did. She sent me to the school psychologist, and he recognized quickly what was happening, and moved me out of that teacher's class, and I went into another class. Now, I wasn't a stupid kid, but I felt stupid. I didn't get good grades, mainly because we were gone all the time. To conventions and to meetings, and that would cut into school. It would cut into school work. I never was able to find time to concentrate on homework. Sometimes we would go visit my family in Florida, and my parents would take an extra week of around Easter time. So I missed a week of school there during Easter vacation to visit my grandparents and my aunt and uncle and cousins down in Florida. So I consequently didn't do very well throughout school. And the way schools work is that you gain a reputation, and teachers pass that reputation from one to another. And now I didn't do terribly poorly. I mean, I was C's and sometimes D's. But in high school, that's when I started to rebel. I wanted to be like the cool kids, because I didn't feel right. I didn't feel like a normal person, whatever a normal person was. And so I rebelled, and I began at the age of 14 drinking alcohol, and which wasn't hard to do. It wasn't hard to get. There was an Elks Club near us, and my friend's father was the bartender of the Elks Club, and they gave him a house as part of his payment right next to the Elks Club, and so his family lived right next to the Elks Club. And he worked all night long. I made friends with their children, and we would sneak into the basement of the Elks Club, where there was a large walk-in cooler, and we'd steal wine and beer, cases of beer, Valentine X, Schaefer, Rheingold, stuff like that, cheap beer. But nonetheless, it had the effect, and it took me out of myself, and I liked it, and I started smoking, and people would sell us cigarettes, even underage. Even though I was under 18, I could buy cigarettes at 14, 15 years old. It wasn't very stringent, not very strict in those days. Cigarettes were 25 cents a pack at the time. And I would steal money from my mother's wallet and go out and on a Friday night, meet up with friends on the tracks behind my house, the railroad tracks. And I had phony proof that I had stolen from a police officer who was passed out in his car at the Elks Club. And half the time it worked, and I was able to buy Yago or cheap Ripple Red, Zapple wine, and Boone's Farm wines, or straight vodka, anything to get me drunk and to take me away from the misery of my childhood, of my life, of what it was like. And things became particularly difficult, especially between me and my father when I was 16, 17 years old, because they were still treating me as if they had complete and whole authority over me. And I rebelled against that, and I was rebelling against that authority. And my brothers were picking up on that, and they were getting into trouble, and so I was being blamed for their troubles. And so I guess to the point, it really, the whole way I grew up dug deep, anchored itself deep within my psyche. I was very strongly aware that I was not like other people. I was very strongly aware that I was less than other people. I didn't think I was as smart as other people. And it was a very gradual, very slow progress that began in high school, when there were mixed experiences. The way I felt about myself, the way the religion made me feel, the way my parents made me feel about myself, and some of the success that I had. And one of the problems that I had with as a child was I would fall into a rage. I remember one time at the age of 12, I had made a friend in school who invited me over to his home to play. And we went out into the woods, and there was a little creek that ran behind his house, a very, very small, almost rivulet kind of a creek, but there was a flow in it, and we built a dam and made a pond behind it. And we were just kids, 12 years old, floating sticks, making believe we were using our imaginations, making believe that we were floating boats or whatever. I don't know. We used our imagination. And one of his neighbors was several years older than both of us, and he was a football player in high school. And he was a big kid, much bigger than either one of us. And I think he was a linebacker or something, or a lineman, but he was huge, and he was also a bully. And he came back into the woods and found us, playing in this water, making this dam, and for what seemed forever, he terrorized us. He just kind of played with us, and you could see he could enjoy making us scared. And I can't remember the things he said, but it was his behavior and his attitude that I could tell was scary. But he finally, then after it was sort of a crescendo he was building up to, and then he picks up a big rock and he just destroys the dam that we made with this rock. And I snapped. I lost it. I'm this skinny little 12-year-old kid, and I picked up the first stick that I could find. It was probably an inch and a half in diameter, and his back was turned away from me towards my friend, and I swung it as hard as I could, like a baseball bat, and I snapped. I hit him across the back as hard as I could, and he fell to the ground. I had hit him so hard he just fell down, and he was hurt. He was writhing on the ground in pain for a second, and then you could see the anger flush across him, and he got himself up and he chased me, and I ran for my life. And I never ran so hard in my life, and because he was heavy set, he couldn't keep up with me. And that guy chased me for about a year. Luckily, I got away from him, but anytime I saw that kid, he would go after me. He never did catch up with me, and after a while, he let up. He forgot. But for about a year, he chased me. And these were periodic episodes that I had. I could not control. I couldn't understand why I had these episodes, and I had these through my entire life, even into my adult life. Not that I ever really hurt anybody, but I would terrorize my family with my snap rage, and I couldn't understand it. I hated myself. I didn't understand it at all, and I thought that by embracing the truth, by embracing the faith, by embracing that, it would help me. But it just made things worse. I can remember as another factor as a kid, not only one but several children, their parents had told their kids, and then they would tell me, because we were friends, when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, that I was mentally retarded. And, that doesn't make you feel, that doesn't build your self-esteem either. And that was reinforced by how my parents treated us, and treated me in particular. And I didn't know. That was one of them. I went into through school with this preconceived notion that I was not like other people, that I was mentally retarded, that I was less than other people, that I needed to see a school psychiatrist because I was defective in some way, and all of these things, just came together. And I remember in ninth grade that I had joined the freshman basketball team. Now, my parents never really encouraged me to join any sports. We weren't really supposed to do that sort of thing in the world, but I did anyway. I defied them, and I went to freshman basketball, and I got on the team, and but I wasn't a starter because I hadn't played basketball before. I never really was on any team in junior high school or middle school, they call it, and anyway, on one of the practice days, one of the guys, we were playing a scrimmage game, and one of the guys on the team, I had the ball. Somebody had passed me the ball, and I was on the second team. And one of the guys on the first team, it was a dirty move, and he basically smashed me to the ground. And I went into one of my rages. And except this time, instead of lashing out at the kid, on the very next play, I was hyped up on adrenaline, and I stole the ball, and I dribbled through about 5 guys with complete rage, and I went from one end of the court all the way down to the other end, and I made the basket, and I was just steaming, angry, and nobody was going to get in my way. And the coach stopped the play and said, "Hey," called me out by name, and he says, "You know what just happened?" He said, "You used your anger, and you just dribbled through 5 people, and you made the basket. You stole the ball, dribbled through 5 people, and made the basket." And he says, "Anger is your friend." And I made that connection, and I remembered that for the rest of my life, that I was angry, and directed anger was going to get me places. And so rather than discouraging me from, the rage, that reinforced it. And I became angry, and I became angry at myself. I became angry at the world. I became angry at my religion, and I was going to force myself to be like other people. But I didn't realize how strongly the oppression of having grown up in the Bible students was. And I can recall when things would get out of my control, when things were just overwhelming to me, that I'd feel these like out of body experiences, like I was watching from the outside in, that I wasn't really connected. And this happened into my early 20s. I understand now that that's dissociation, and that's a defense mechanism. But I didn't know that, and I needed help, and I needed real help. But it was things like basketball, where I ended up in 9th grade being voted the most improved player on the freshman team. And then I became very good and ended up on the varsity team, and then got injured so badly. I hurt my knee so badly that I couldn't play for the entire season. And so I lost my opportunity to play varsity. And we had a state championship team before that, so I wasn't able to make varsity until my senior year. But then my senior year, we were at a Bible students' children's gathering, and we were playing football in a break. So one of us took a football outside, and I went out for a pass, and I ran into a parked car with my knee, and I really damaged my knee, and it knocked me out for the whole basketball season. And this was the day before basketball was supposed to start. And I can remember sitting in that meeting, all-day meeting, in utter pain. And I really should have been, at a hospital getting treated. And I can remember the elder there laughing at me. My knee, the size of a basketball, it had just swollen up, huge. And he was laughing at me and making fun. Did it hurt? A real man, they hold back on the hurt, on the pain. So be a man, and that's how things were, and it wasn't until I met my wife that I became really, really motivated. I mean, I became an auto mechanic, and after high school, I didn't go to trade school. I just ended up in auto mechanics, just drifted after high school. But I picked it up pretty quickly, and I realized that I wasn't stupid. And I decided that I wanted to try college. And it wasn't until I was 23 and I met my wife, and we fell head over heels about one another. And her family were a fringe Bible student family, and they were all highly educated in that family. Both parents had college degrees. The two older children, my wife's oldest sister and brother, had degrees from top-notch colleges, Princeton University and Smith College. Her brother had gone to UVA and got his medical degree, and was doing his residency in Charleston, South Carolina when I met my wife and when we got married. He was opposed to our marriage, but by that point I had become a fully certified auto mechanic in all areas, and that meant I had to pass tests. And I realized that I was passing these tests with 100%, 90%, and some of these things were pretty complex. And I wanted to go to college so badly, and that became something that I really wanted to do. I saw what it did for my wife and her family, and my wife was in college, and that was really an inspiration to me. But after we got married, her father decided to cut off funds for her to attend college, and so me working as an auto mechanic, I couldn't send her to college, and so she had to drop out in her third year. She was almost done with college, but there was nothing that we could do about it, and so she got a job working at a Lord & Taylor's, and in a sales position, and we lived in Northern Virginia for a couple of years. I had moved down and got a job at a dealership so she could go to college, but now that her father had cut off college funds, there was no sense in us being in Virginia, and I wanted to be back. I was newly consecrated and baptized into the Bible students, and I wanted to be near the center of things and back where I grew up in the New York area, so that we could be near the Dawn Bible students and near the New York Bible students class where I grew up. And so we, after 2 years in Northern Virginia, we being married and living in Northern Virginia for 2 years, we moved to New York, and the Dawn needed a cook, and so we talked about it, and I really urged her. I was becoming fanatical about the Bible students, and I pushed her into being the cook at the Dawn. But at that time, we were also expecting a baby. And so my wife had our first child while we were at the Dawn. And that was the first time that ever happened. And we were very fortunate that there was a manager there who was very open-minded and tolerant, and allowed us, I guess the need, because it was so difficult to keep a cook, the need to keep her was much greater than to go by policy, and they were losing cooks once a year. It was a very difficult job, and so she was glad to stay on, and we did it under the agreement that I would go to college, and so I talked to my father-in-law, and he agreed to pay for my college while my wife worked, his daughter, and supported us while she supported us while I was going to college. And she really worked hard. She had to work very, very hard, but she stuck with it. And she also became an invaluable help to me in college, because she had 3 years of college, and she could help me with organizing papers and how to think and how to write, and so she was an invaluable help to me. But I had to make up an awful lot of missed school because I hadn't done well. But from the time I started, at first I started a community college to pick up remedial courses that would allow me to go to a 4-year university. And I started getting, I had a 4.0 grade point average there, and that was the first time in my life that I realized that I could do something, that I was smart. And then I transferred from the community college. I was accepted into Rutgers University, and I majored in physics because I like to know how things worked. I was an auto mechanic, and I wanted to understand how complex systems worked. And physics was the best way to do it, and I was pretty good at math, so I decided that physics was the way I wanted to go. What I didn't realize was that in order to do anything really in physics, you needed a PhD. A bachelor's degree in physics by itself really wasn't going to get me the kind of job I needed to get to support a family. And while I was in school, we had a second child. And all along at that time, the Bible students became increasingly, because the Dawn was the center of the Bible student world, became increasingly antagonistic towards us and me, thinking that we were taking advantage of the Dawn while we were only making $150 a month. total. I mean, they were only paying her. They weren't paying me. And I was doing work for the Dawn. I was doing a lot of work, keeping the houses maintained. I was doing the yard work and the lawn work and painting that needed to be done and upkeep. And whenever a vehicle broke down, they had a number of vehicles. I would fix them for free because I had those mechanical skills. And so I did an awful lot of work for the Dawn. And I was going to school full time at the same time. So I was really working and going to college. But it still didn't. The fact that I graduated, with high honors, and I won the physics department award, and I was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa, and also invited into Sigma Chi. But I was tired, and I didn't want to do the project work to enter Sigma Chi, and I didn't know really what it was, and I was very naive at the time. Even after 4 years of college, I was still quite naive. And so, having 2 children and a wife to support, I decided to look for a job. And I found that the environmental business was booming at the time. And so I got a job with AT&T Bell Laboratories, a very prestigious company in New Jersey. It was the research branch of AT&T, which was the telephone service for the U.S. And they had just been broken up under a monopoly, but yet they were still a huge company at the time with over 300,000 employees. And Bell Labs had 30,000 employees in New Jersey and three major facilities in New Jersey. So I worked at all 3 facilities doing environmental work, and they paid for my graduate degree in environmental engineering. And so I worked for Bell Labs for about 2 years while I was getting my graduate degree at night, master's degree in environmental engineering. And then I ended up getting into the pharmaceutical business. And from that point on, I worked as an environmental engineer in various capacities and in two large pharmaceutical companies. But that didn't take care of the psychological problems that I had, and the feelings. I felt like an imposter, like I didn't deserve. Somehow I fooled people. I still had this lack of self-esteem. And I didn't really understand that, and I still had this problem with rage, and it became worse and worse because I didn't know how to cope, and I reverted to my old teenage friend, alcohol, to cope with issues and problems that I was running into at home, things that I wasn't prepared to deal with. And especially when I was, I was 32 when I graduated college, and I had a full family to support on a beginning salary. And my father-in-law, he said it would be wrong for my wife, morally wrong for my wife to work and for the kids to be put into daycare. So we had to live off of my beginning salary, and that put financial pressures on us immediately. And so I didn't know how to handle all of this. I just didn't know how to handle it. and we were we were we were fighting, and we were having trouble. And after 10 years of having been at the Dawn, we living in a communal situation, you have people watching at all times your behavior. So you have to be very careful about things and quiet. And but once we left, after we were at the Dawn for 10 years, after we left and we were on our own in our own apartment, there was nobody there listening, watching. And so my rage, my problems with temper really became manifest. I didn't know how to cope. And then my father died in '95, and things just seemed to be falling apart. And financially, we were getting really mixed messages. My father-in-law was, telling us that it was morally wrong for my wife to work and leave the kids home and go off to work and the kids are off at school and not being taken care of, by a mother at home in a traditional sense, the Ozzie and Harriet sense. And so that created a lot of stress within our family, and I didn't know how to handle it, and I drank to handle it, and I hated myself. I would fly into rages, and we had terrible fights, and I felt horrible about the environment that we were creating for our children, the environment that I was creating. And I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I swore over and over and over and over again to God that I would never behave like that again. And before you know it, boom, I went into another rage. And it was just impossible. And finally, my wife had spoken with her brother, and who had become by then a very powerful man. He was the one of the most powerful executives in Pfizer, and he was the global head of Pfizer's research department in infectious disease, and he had a big home, and he had undergone a divorce and recently had become disfellowshipped himself by Bible students in Connecticut from several classes. And so he had, even despite the fact that he was disfellowshipped, he still believed very strongly in the Bible students' teachings, Russell's teachings. And he married, he had an affair, and he divorced his first wife, and then married the girl that he had an affair with, who also happened to be somebody who worked for him. And that's what he got disfellowshipped over. And they had a big home up in an expensive area of Connecticut, and they had worked it out with my wife because things became so chaotic with me at home that he invited her to come up to live with them, and so she did. She took the kids, and I came home to an empty house, and it was just terrible. I thought that was the end of our marriage. I thought that was the end of things, and I believed that it was my fault, that I deserved it. And my neighbor across the street, he was a a professor at a local college, state college, and also a lawyer. And so I went over and I asked him, hey, Fred, do you know any good divorce lawyers? It looks like things are ending for us. And he could see I was in a mess, just an emotional mess. And he says, you know what you need? You need counseling. You don't need a lawyer. And he gave me a card to somebody that he had been seeing. And so that's how I started counseling. And it began to have an effect. It doesn't, counseling only works when you put time into it. And if you get the right counselor, counseling isn't the magic pill. It isn't the thing that isn't going to solve all your problems. But if you put in the effort, you put in the time, and the counselor is good and resonates with you, it can make a difference. So anyway, after 4 months, my brother-in-law initially would prevent me from having any contact with my wife. And so I didn't see my wife or kids for the first month and a half after they left me, which was around May, late April, early May. And I thought that our marriage was done. But I went to the counselor, and after a while, my wife had decided that by that point, my brother-in-law and his new wife, they had a blended family. She had 2 boys, and I had a niece through my brother-in-law. And so between my kids and their kids, my wife became the nanny or au pair for the household up there in Connecticut. And but after a while, she realized that it was wrong for her to keep the kids away from me. By that point, my brother-in-law and my father-in-law were scheming to keep us apart and to eventually adopt my children and take them away from us. That's a whole different story in itself, but ultimately that's what they had in mind, and I know what they were going to do. At the time, I didn't know, but I figured it out later, and they also admitted to it later. But after 4 months, my wife caught on that they were up to something, that her father and her brother were up to something. And so she called me up in the middle of the night, and I drove from our home in northern New Jersey to east of Connecticut, east of New Haven. It was about a 2-hour ride. And I picked up my kids, my wife, in the middle of the night, 2:00 in the morning. And it was not a very pleasant scene. And I had a minor confrontation with my brother-in-law, but it was more or less a duel of wits, and I gave him the 1-2 punch basically, and hit him where it hurt. Really, he knew that he was this big, powerful director and global head at Pfizer. He still depended on his father for decisions and for advice on handling things, and I point that out, that dependence that he had, that here he is, this big man, and he can't make decisions on his own, and that basically stopped the discussion then and there, and I got my family back, and things went well for a number of years. I went to a counselor for 3 years, and things began to improve, and my wife began to join me in some of the sessions, and things looked like they were going well. The counselor, however, was a Christian counselor, and he put a lot of onus on depending on God and praying to God for help, and that's not what I needed, and that wasn't the kind of counseling I should have been getting. He was a certified individual counselor, but in psychology, but he wasn't the one, and being unknowledgeable and naive in this area, I didn't understand that he wasn't the best psychologist for me to be going to. And when I stopped going to him, my behavior, we were not addressing ways for me to deal with situations, and I still found myself reacting. I reverted very quickly back to spontaneous rage and reaction because I wasn't dealing with, I wasn't getting the proper therapy, and so there weren't any real changes, and so after a few years, and my drinking worsened, and my brother committed suicide, and that had a profound effect on me. And that was in 2001. And by 2002, I had gotten a DUI, and that was the real turning point in my life. And, there are, like all things, there were key turning points. I mean, it's like the Civil War. They keep talking about what was the main turning point of the Civil War. Well, there were many turning points. There was Antietam, and there was the election of 1864, and there was the many different. Gettysburg was a turning point. There wasn't just one factor. There were many different factors that were involved that caused the outcome to be what it was. And that was the way it was with my life, that there were key points in my life, but no one single factor that would turn things around. They were a compilation of things that occurred at different times in my life that caused things to turn around in my life. And so after a number of years of counseling, it didn't take very long for me to revert back to my previous behavior. And one night I don't even know what the fight was about, but it was a January evening, and my wife, I had been drinking, and we had gotten into a big fight, a verbal argument, and my wife begged me not to leave. And I said, I'm leaving. I'm just walking out the door and I'm leaving the house. And she begged me not to go out, that I was too drunk and that I shouldn't be out driving. And my daughter, both of them begging me, and I ignored them. And I in my rage, just got in the car and off I went. Well, I went out and drank some more, and I was really a danger on the road. I should not have been behind the wheel, and I got a DUI, and I was arrested, and I was brought in about 11:30 at night to a police station and handcuffed to a ring. They did the breathalyzer test, and I failed pretty badly, and then that was it. I had to go to a mandated course called IDRC. It was for a course that all people who are arrested for DUI had to take. I still believe the program is in place today. And in that 2-day, it was a weekend-long session or seminar, and they had a variety of professionals and people talking about alcoholism and the reasons for it, and what all the statistics on what it costs for DUI. And by the way, at the time, I'll freely say it cost me at least $30,000 to have my first DUI. So if anybody has an issue, just the money problem alone, the insurance went up to $8,000 a year, and this was 15 years ago, so I can't imagine what it is now. But I lost my license for a year. I couldn't drive, and there's no temporary license that you can get to go back and forth to work. So I was dependent. And luckily, I had a boss who was a kind man, much better than anybody I knew in the Bible students, a worldly person. And he took me back and forth to work every day for that entire year. And it was just mind-blowing. And I began to realize that my faith and my beliefs didn't keep me from behaving the way I was behaving. In fact, I finally was able to understand that it was exactly those beliefs that caused me to be in the problem that I was in. And so they also had people from Alcoholics Anonymous come in and talk. And so I decided that I would give Alcoholics Anonymous a try. And I began attending voluntarily Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was going to 10, 12 meetings a week. And things began to improve. But the problem with Alcoholics Anonymous is it's another cultish organization where it uses shame and required attendance, separation. They call everybody outside of the organization earth people, and that the world would be much better if they lived by the principles of the AA and the 12 steps, and it puts all the onus on the individual that as the drinking problem, and it doesn't get down into. I mean, the fourth step is one where you write out your inventory and your personal inventory, and basically it's a guilt trip, and I ran into AA groups where they expected, basically a book. I mean, one guy talked about his 180-page four-step inventory that had a glossary and a table of contents and the whole works before it was accepted by his sponsor. And sponsors are just individuals that have gone through the program and gone through the 12 steps, and they're not trained psychologists, they're not professionals, they're just the average Joe who, like everybody else, had gone through the AA program and read the AA book, and it doesn't make them qualified to get to the core of the problems of what caused the drinking. And in my case, I needed that. I needed to understand why I behaved the way I did and why I wasn't able to cope. And it's not just a matter of having, and I didn't want people just looking over my shoulder and saying, you're not going to drink today. I wanted to understand why I was the way I was, and I wanted to get down to the roots of the problem. Because the way AA is structured, it doesn't get to the core of the problem. It doesn't deal with your psyche. It just uses shame and guilt to prevent you from, and a support group to prevent you from drinking. But you're required to go, and if you quit going, then you revert back to you're likely to revert back to your old behavior, because you're not learning coping skills. You're not learning the things necessary. You're not getting the psychological understanding of what you need to understand, and other that cause you to drink, that cause you to behave the way you behave under certain circumstances, and that's not an easy deal, and for every individual, it's different. I got a good counselor this time. I've seen this counselor for 15 years. It took a while for me to open up in many areas, to discuss the abuse, especially the sexual abuse, the psychological abuse. I had a strong guilt feeling for that I was going against God because I was using worldly help, somebody that didn't understand the truth, and eventually I realized that all of that was what was the problem with me to begin with, was the religion and the belief system, and how it affected me, and how it caused me to have a sense low self-esteem, and not and telling me that I was essentially worthless, and when I came to understand these things, and when I learned to take the cognitive therapy and put it into practice, and it takes work. It takes a lot of work, because it's not just learning about yourself. It's not just there are things that you have to do. You have to practice, that you have to put into practice to become yourself, because your sense of who you are, the way you value yourself is all dependent on putting the pieces together and learning behavioral techniques when certain circumstances arise. It's a very complex situation. This is a topic that I talk with my counselor frequently about. Is there ever any true healing. Anyone can somebody really heal 100%? And I think about it a little bit of like an analogy of an injury. It all depends on the individual and how severely damaged they are. I mean, I have a scar on my knee from the time I was 13 when I fell off of a bicycle, and it's still with me. And so, while I'm not bleeding, there is a residual effect that was left from that injury. The brain is the same way. When your sense of self isn't allowed to develop in a proper way, is when you're not shown love, when you're not shown the kind of consideration and care that a child needs to thrive, to grow up, to be healthy, to be whole, and to have a good sense of self. When they're deprived of that, it depends on the individual. It's so complicated. There's the genetic factor. There's the environment which the person is subjected to, and each individual is different, and the degree of injury is different, and so what works with one person may not necessarily work with another individual, and also the degree to which the person wants help, wants to heal, wants to get better. And I mean, when you look at the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, it's constantly being revised. You have the many disorders there, that some of them are related. You have narcissistic personality disorder. You have the Axis 1, Axis 2 disorders, and the personality disorders, are all related to each other in some way, and often there is a comorbidity that occurs, so it's not a simple situation for treatment. And you have narcissistic personality disorder, you have histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, schizotypal, and so many different personality disorders the degree to which an individual is impacted and their sense of self is fragmented, whether or not they're suffering from depression at the same time. Are they suffering from a more untreatable form? I mean, a permanent. Personality disorders can be dealt with quite effectively if the individual wants to be healed, and they take the time to work at it. Others require medication because it's a permanent. The schizophrenia. My brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and there was no cure for him, and he gradually slipped into a decline over the years that worsened, and eventually ended up with his suicide. And that happened to many of the young people that I grew up with. Suicide was not uncommon. I mean, when I look at the 60 or 70 kids that I grew up with, peers, three committed suicide, and one of them was my brother, and that's higher, way higher than the national average. which is something like 19 per 100,000 people or whatever, 12. I think it's 12 per 100,000 people. So, they're 3 out of 60 or 70 or even 3 out of 100. That's 3%. Was much higher than the statistic for the population and as a whole, the general population as a whole. So treatment isn't always an effective thing. My brother had piles and piles of psych reports. Every time he was admitted into a psychiatric hospital, he kept all of the documentation. And when he finally did pass away in 2001, he left all these reports that I brought home. I had to clean out his apartment, and my wife and I spent a week cleaning out his apartment, and he had died there, and he hadn't been found for a week by his caseworker, and so the smell of death was embedded in the apartment, and there's nothing like it. Only somebody who's experienced that can. It's an unforgettable experience, and something that I hope never to experience again. But he left these reports for me to. Eventually, I read them, and they went back. There were conversations in these reports with counselors that substantiated memories I had of my mother's abuse of us and dressing us up as little girls and putting rouge on our faces and treating us as if we were dolls. My mother was a very sick woman, and I remember much worse. There was sexual abuse, and up until I was 12 years old, and I would be in a haze and kind of phase out from reality that this wasn't happening to me. But can somebody fully heal? Well, I have to say that since counseling and the work and the effort I put into it, the degree to which I love my family, the degree to which I want to be loved, is motivated me, made me work, made me really want to make an effort into healing, and I really love my family with all my heart, with everything, and I try. I am limited, and I can't do the things that I wish I could do for them, but we're very close knit. We're tighter than we've ever been before, and I do think that tremendous strides that we have a life that we would never otherwise have. We have a closeness that we and a bond that we would never otherwise have if we hadn't gone through the experiences that we went through. If I hadn't gone through the experiences that I had gone through, or put the effort into getting better that I put myself into. But then there are others that just can't recover, like my brother. And no matter what, there wasn't going to be any hope for him. And the eventual suicide was, that was inevitable. It was inevitable. There wasn't anything that was going to prevent that from happening, no matter what. And I think back many times, especially because my father always made me the one responsible for my brother's welfare when I was a kid, made me responsible for their behavior, blamed me for their behavior. And so that residual question there, was there something I could have done to prevent that nags me at times. And I realized I couldn't do anything to prevent his taking his own life. There was nothing I could do. But yet that nagging question is in the back of my mind, always present, always there, that I was responsible for his care, and that somehow, some way, I should have been able to prevent this. And no, there isn't 100% healing, no matter what. I mean, I haven't had a fit of rage for years, many years, decades now, since the time I marched out and got the DUI. It's been a long time now since I've ever had a fit, and that is just not a part of me now. It's gone. It's gone because of the therapy, because of my putting myself into the work that was necessary to change, but also the damage that was done is permanent, is there, is never ever going to change. And I see these movies. My kids, they like to make fun of me because I'm the first one to cry at a movie. But if I see something like a series I just saw with Stellan Skarsgård, it's called River, and he's a man that a police officer, investigator, who is suffering from mental disorder, and he's trying to solve the murder of his partner, and the suffering that he has. I can't. I watched the show, but I can't do so without really feeling what was going on there, because I feel and I understand. I connect in some ways to the situation that was presented, even though it's just a fictional story. It's a fictional story based on reality, and that happens all too often. I connect to these things that bring back feelings and emotions and memories that I had, and I realize that the wounds are there, and how sensitive, how open they can be, that there is a delicacy there that can't be denied, that there's something permanent that was done that I'll never outlive. I mean, I'm already 62 years old, and I won't outlive that. And that was done because of this hypocritical, horrendous religion, and the abusive childhood that I underwent. I have friends who deal with it by cutting out that whole memory of their childhood. They don't understand why certain things happen in their lives, or why they may have certain troubles with alcohol or substance abuse. But they somehow they manage, and they forget, and they've cut that part out of their lives. I can't do that. I had to face it. I had to understand it, because the degree to which I was damaged was interfering with my personal relationships in a way that I just didn't want to have happen. I couldn't happen. I loved my family, and I didn't want to be a problem. And I wanted to understand. I had to understand what it was that happened to me as I grew up. And so I have to say, in that sense, there's been a great deal of success, but it's also left me with a great deal of sadness, because I understand now that how senseless it was, how senseless the whole thing was, and that it was such a terrible thing, because it was all false. It was all for nothing. It was all for a bunch of beliefs that were fabricated out of a flawed book that people hold sacred, that can be interpreted 1,000 different ways. You go to Wikipedia and look up Christianity and look at the literally the thousands of ways in which the Bible can be interpreted. Which is the truth? Which one of those thousands of Christian beliefs is the truth? And the fact that anyone could say, we have the truth and we're the only ones with the truth, and be abusive and force these beliefs and behaviors and customs and cultures and values and into a person and make them believe, that's abuse. That is abuse, and that shouldn't happen. How can there be a God that allows that? Certainly, it's not a God of the Bible, because there is no one truth that can be gotten from that book. A flawed book, a primitive book, a book that was written thousands of years ago and is wrong in so many ways, in scientific and other ways. I don't have to stand there and prove it, but I see people like this, this man who built the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and my mind is, I'm so caught up now. His name has slipped my memory. He's that Aussie evangelistic extremist who. That was the type of person that was in my life and telling me that we had the truth, and forcing it down on us, upon us, and that's abusive, and that needs to stop. That needs to stop. And that kind of extremism, and that's what the Bible breeds, and that's what religion in general breeds, because there is no, when you look at science, science has an answer. Science has a very good answer to the questions that have plagued man, that caused man to invent religion to begin with, to answer the questions that were unanswerable. How and why are we here? And science is getting to the it's on the right track of getting us to an answer to those questions, and we must abandon those old ideas, because those old ideas destroy us, they damage us, and they hurt us. And anyway, I opened up. That's only a minuscule part of my life, but I hope at least somebody gets some benefit from this experience. And I did open up more than I planned to do, but anyway, that I was motivated by something that I had just seen. It just tripped a cascade of emotions, and I couldn't help it. I just had to speak my mind. So anyway, I wish everybody the best, and I hope that at least to some degree, maybe this could be helpful to somebody. So take care.